I don't mean to brag, but I have a very large brain.
Before you ask, no, it wasn't that easy to make. Hello everyone and welcome to this devlog. Today we're going to be designing and programming an infinite game mode for my mobile game Bob the Ball. You might be wondering why I need an infinite game mode for my mobile game. Well,
the mobile parkour adventure style game was originally designed to feature 5 levels of gameplay, focusing on the physics of a ball that is controlled by the player. This was great, and it's still going to be the main idea or the primary concept of gameplay. However, it's taken me quite a while to develop each of the levels to a high standard with minimal bugs and test them and things like that, and I'm wanting to get the game on the App Store as soon as possible, so I need something that could promote my game to a minimum viable product. So after planning different approaches and considering the time I have free, I decided that making a form of infinite gameplay would be the best option going forward and would definitely work on a mobile platform. For example, you have Flappy Bird. To keep it related to the main gameplay, I chose to have rocks randomly generated in front of the player, with the overall goal being to get as many jumps as possible without falling into lava or being destroyed by the lava that is chasing you as you move. To keep it interesting and desirable in the final game state, I also plan on putting coins across the rocks so that players can get coins in infinite mode more efficiently than from the main gameplay element.
okay, so the main things I need for this game mode to work are
Random rock generation and placement, random rock rotation adjustments, lava layer and object deletion, player score tracking, and finally coin placement. For the core element of the game mode, the rock generation, I started by creating an initial rock that the player spawns above. Then I programmed a basic rock generation function that randomly chooses a position within some defined bounds and called that multiple times at different distances from the starting rock to create a few initial rocks for the player to traverse. This meant that the player essentially wouldn't see the initial rocks being generated, it would appear as though they were already there. From here I worked on having the rock prefab be randomly chosen. This part seemed easy at first, but it did bring me a few challenges as each of the rocks are different shapes and sizes, so I had to alter the scale randomly within strict limits and even have specific scaling rules for one of the rock's shapes as it became too flat in certain scale decisions. After this, it was pretty easy to use this function for an infinite amount of generations, relying on the position of the interacted rock to give a boundary for the position of the next rock. To explain this a little clearer, I've designed a little diagram here. So as the player collides with the rock, as you can see in this little diagram, in the background it randomly chooses all the information needed. It then gets the collided rock's position and adds that position information onto that, resulting in a random forward-based new rock, which you can see which the arrow is pointing out. So that's the newly generated rock, and because of the manually spawned rocks at the beginning of the game mode, there are never any gaps between the game objects that are too large. Next is the rotation. This is probably the biggest pain in the arse. After trying a few different ways of handling the random rotation of the objects, I decided on having 3 return functions, one for each axis. The y-axis would just return a random angle between 0 and 360. I actually later on decided to change that from 0 to 36 and then times that figure by 10. That way I got a more rounded up number so that we didn't have lots of different floating about, pun not intended. But I chose to do the 360 as the flat rotation of the rock didn't really matter that much apart from the visual appearance. But for the X and Z axis, I had to set the rotation values manually for each axis to avoid certain jumps becoming impossible due to extreme angles. This is just a case of trial and error, so I spent probably a good 45 minutes going into the editor, trying a rotation of a rock and then trying it on a different rock and then trying a different rotation, etc, etc. And then eventually I came up with 6 values for each axis. At this point I essentially have a bare minimum working infinite mode because the rocks will generate infinitely and they will also rotate infinitely so that they look random enough. But it does look quite dull and it doesn't really match the style of the main gameplay, so now it's time to generate some lava. Initially, I was going to instantiate the lava prefabs at the same time as the rocks are generated, just past the player's view, and then delete the lava that has been passed by the player. This is okay, but it meant that for every rock there was a layer of lava being instantiated, which isn't incredibly efficient, and furthermore it also meant that sometimes there were 4 to 5 rocks in one layer of lava, so if for every rock you jumped, you could have generated 5 rows of lava, and essentially it was being spawned out of proportion to the rocks. Eventually, I found an even easier and probably more performance-friendly way of creating the lava. All I would do is have the lava pre-placed just enough to fill the player's viewpoint, which was around 5 to 7 rows, and then I would simply move the most rear row to the front once the player was a certain distance from it, so that the player couldn't see it. After doing some basic math to remove the gaps between the rows of lava, it worked out perfectly. Player's score tracking was relatively easy. Every time a player collides with a rock, I just had to increase their UI score by 1. Then when they die, the code will check if the UI score is higher than their saved personal best. If it is, then it will just overwrite the old personal best with the new personal best. There was, however, a problem with this, and I will come back to this later on in the video. Regarding coin placement, I started with spawning a coin every 10 rocks, ensuring that it is always placed above any rock, no matter its scale, position or rotation. For now, I've kept it at this interval as I believe it acts as an incentive to keep going further in the infinite mode. I did also think about having the coins be randomly placed between 2 and 10 instead of always every 10, or having it randomly decide whether to place more than one coin on the rock it's chosen, or even to have coin multipliers for each 10 rocks that it passes. So for example, once you get to the 20th rock, you get 2 coins for getting 1 coin, if that makes sense. What do you guys think about this? Let me know what you think would work best in the comments below. Whilst you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel to keep up to date with all of the devlogs that I have planned, and to have a direct input on the games that I'm planning to make and release. Okay, so a large problem I had with the game mode was ironically the player's score, as occasionally, very rarely, but occasionally the rocks would be generated close enough to each other that players could skip over rocks, therefore not counting their score for that jump, as it would only count the jump if the player had physically collided with each individual rock. This also led to the player eventually catching up with the rock generator, as it would skip some of the spawns due to the player not having collided with every rock along the way. The easiest fix to this would be to increase the random distance between the rocks, but it was already very high and very unpredictable, and increasing it further would remove the fun random element to the idea. The next plan I had was to have the rocks have trigger colliders. This way, every time a player passes its barrier, it is counted, and funnily enough, this works perfectly.
And there we have it, a working infinite game mode for my mobile game. I would have liked to have added some more procedurally generated scenery and background rocks. However, I'm trying to remain aware of the performance abilities and restrictions when it comes to mobile games, because obviously it's nowhere near as powerful as a Windows PC, for example. I also want to stay away from spending too much time on making the game too perfect, because I am a really bad perfectionist and I really want to get the game to a state that's playable more than looks amazing. At the end of the day, players want a game that's playable more than they want something that looks great, but you can't play it that well. What do you guys think? How important do you think procedural generation of scenery in this kind of game mode, how important do you think it is? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know what you'd like to see added to this infinite game mode as well. Anyway, that's how I created the infinite mode for my mobile game, Bob the Ball. I hope that's given you some inspiration for your own games, or even just a new way of looking at some basic game design. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please leave a like and a subscribe. It helps me out massively. It'll keep you in touch for updates for future game releases, as well as the progression of the game. And you can also have a direct input on the game as it develops. And until next time, have a great day and keep coding.